So last week, whether you were with us or not last week online, that's okay. But last week we spoke of a very unusual bracha, of an exception to the rule, that the bracha that the Kohanim make when they get up to duchen and to bless the people in God's name, they say the bracha Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam. Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvah. Asher Kiddishanu. Now, normally, whether we're putting on a talis, whether we're lighting Shabbos candles, putting on tefillin, picking up a lulav and esrog, when we make brachas on mitzvahs, those mitzvahs that have brachas, not every mitzvah has a bracha, topic for a different time. But when we make a bracha on a mitzvah, we say Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav. We acknowledge Hashem as the King of the universe, who Asher Kiddushan v'mitzvotav, who has sanctified us in his commandments. And then we go on to the specific mitzvah. But when it comes to the Kohanim blessing the people, they leave out that phrase b'mitzvotav in his, referring to Hashem's commandments, and they say b'kedushato shel Aharon, in the sanctification of Aaron, the high priest, that we bless his nation, meaning Hashem's nation, with love. So last week that bracha was connected to our ability to understand Aharon and why he was disappointed in not being part of the dedication ceremony, the Chanukat HaMizbeach for the tabernacle. But I want to just add, so we can appreciate something from this bracha, I want to add one more thought, which interestingly comes from a commentary on the Siddur called Dover Shalom, the speaker of peace. I say interesting because Aaron, the high priest, is like the epitome of Shalom. The Pirkei Avos teach us that we should be like the students of Aaron. We should be at Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom, that we should love peace and pursue peace and bring people closer to Torah. So the Dover Shalom in his commentary says, do you know why this bracha was changed? Because when Aharon actually bestowed his blessing to the people, he did it as a self-motivated expression of concern and love for the well-being of the people. And as he says in Hebrew, Lo haya mitzad ha-mitzvah. This was not something that Aaron was commanded to do, nor was Moses commanded to tell Aaron to do. Ela rak me'atzmo. This was his own free-flowing expression of goodwill. And in honor and in the merit of having done that Aaron and his descendants merited being the ones to channel God's blessings to the people. And therefore, says the Dover Shalom, we drop the word b'mitzvotav in his, meaning Hashem's commandments, which we usually put into a bracha on a mitzvah, and we attribute it to the sanctity of Aaron, because the whole mitzvah was created in the merit of Aaron. At the end of last week's Parsha, are you guys hearing me okay?
Yeah.
I'm hearing a little echo. Just one moment, please. I'm testing. That's better. So at the end of last week's Parsha, Miriam and Aaron spoke about Moshe. And while they had a concern about Moshe, the proper person to have spoken to, they were interested. Miriam was the initiator. She was interested in Moshe's welfare and in his wife's welfare, Zipporah. But she should have spoken to Moshe directly. In that episode, which is the final episode of Parshas Beha'aloscha, in that episode, it tells us, right after describing that Miriam spoke to Aaron about her concern, it tells us right after that and immediately before Hashem's reaction, it says, "V'ha'ish Moshe anav me'od mikol ha'adam asher al pnei ha'adamah," that Moshe was the most modest person of all human beings on the face of the earth. My wife asked me the question last week, why do we need to know this at this point? How does this fit in to the story? So I want to answer that question by looking at this week's Parsha of Shlach. The Parsha begins with Moshe sending what we call the spies. Interestingly, and very importantly, the word spies is not used directly here. Hashem speaks to Moshe and says, "Shlach lecha, send for you anashim v'yaturu et eretz Canaan." Now, if you knew no Hebrew at all, and somebody said to you, "I have this word v'yaturu," and if you take out the vav at the beginning, which here is changing its tense, and you take out the plural, and you look at the shorish, the root word, and you vocalize it, a drop to understand it, the word would come from tur. So if someone said to you, "What do you think the Hebrew word tur means?" What would you say?
Look over.
Okay, or you might say tour, to take a tour. I'm a tourist. Go be tourist. It didn't say go be spies. This was a question of sending tourists to go look out, to take a look at the land that Hashem promised to Bnei Yisrael. Rashi asks a question. The formula of the question is one that we looked at before. Last week, we started to look at the question that occasionally Rashi asked the question, Lama nismecha? Why is this story connected to the previous story? And we spoke about that a little bit last week in context of that discussion. But here we have a different discussion. And I think that this new discussion on the same principle in Rashi will help me give an answer to my wife on her question on why last week Moshe is identified as being a modest, the most modest person in the world. And that same answer is going to help us to understand the phenomenon in our lifetime. Not only ours, but definitely in our lifetime as well. So Rashi, he asked the question. Now, the rule that we said last time is like the Medrash asked this question a lot. Many, many times the Medrash asks the question or just goes in and answers the question and tells us why these two stories are put together. But the rule in Rashi, as the Mizrahi and the Siftei Chachamim bring down, is that Rashi himself only chooses a very small portion of these questions found in the Medrash to put into his own Perush. And he does that because of some key possibilities that could come up. that number one, the stories are not listed in order. That number two, that there are some unnecessary words being used. And here in this week's Parsha, we actually have both of those. The commentators on Rashi point out that the Parsha last week, the very last verse in last week's Parsha, which is the end of the story, that because Miriam did speak about Moshe, because it was, even though it was very, very well intentioned, and she only wanted the best for Moshe and for his wife Zipporah, but again, she should have spoken to Moshe, not to even Aaron about it. So Miriam was punished with Torah leprosy, tzara'at, and she had to be excluded from the camp for 7 days. And the people waited for her. We mentioned that last week too. And when her 7 days were over, the Torah tells us, "V'achar nasu ha'am mechatzerot v'yachanu b'midbar paran." When her quarantine was over, the nation traveled from Chatzerot, the name of the place, and they went to the desert of Paran. When our Parsha opens up, our Parsha tells us in the first verse that Hashem spoke to Moshe. In the second verse, it's the command to Moshe, send for you the tourist. And in the third verse of that Parsha, the Torah tells us, "Vayishlach otam Moshe mimidbar Paran," that Moshe sent them, meaning these tourists, what we usually call spies, that Moshe sent these tourists, the heads of tribes, each one of them a head of tribe. He sent them from the desert of Paran. So in other words, last week we were talking about Chatzerot. Now and it ends that we set up camp in Paran at the end of last week's Parsha. And now Moshe is in the desert of Paran and he sends the spies. The problem of chronology is that the story of Korach took place in Chatzerot. That means sometime last week. In fact, of the 3 episodes that I've just referred to, the order of them is Korach's attempted rebellion against Moshe is number 1. Miriam's talking about Moshe is number 2. And number 3 is setting up camp in Paran. So Korach was the first, but he's in next week's Parsha. So it's out of order. So the Medrash, quoted by Rashi, says, why is it out of order? Because the Torah, again, wanted us to think and say, why did God tell Moshe to write this out of order? What is the message here? And we have 2 of these messages being out of order, and within 3 psukim, repeating the fact that we were in the desert of Paran. Both of them are questionable. And the reason for that, as Rashi quotes, is Lefi shelikta al iskei diba shedibra be'acheha. Here it was. Miriam spoke something that was unbecoming about her brother, and she got punished. And here comes another story of people who should be able to learn from the lesson that you don't speak unbecoming things either about the land that God promised to his nation, the good land that Hashem promised to his nation. Rav Soloveitchik really addressed some other questions. I'm going to ask my wife not to let me forget that I wanted, after talking about Rav Soloveitchik's questions, I want to make sure I answer her question from last week. Soloveitchik basically addressed the question is, I mean, you know what the whole episode was, is that Moshe separated from his wife. That because he was a prophet, he separated from his wife. Now, Miriam and Aaron were also prophets. We don't usually refer to Aaron as a prophet. We refer to him as being the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol, but he was a prophet. And Miriam, we do refer to, even in the Torah, as a prophetess. So Miriam was married and Aaron was married. And they stayed married and they stayed physically connected with their spouses. But Moshe physically separated from his spouse. And Miriam is saying, God speaks to us. She says to her brother Aaron, God speaks to Moshe. Why does Moshe have to separate from his wife? We weren't told to separate from our spouses. Now, let me ask you something. Do you think that Miriam and Aharon understood that Moshe was greater than they? Or did they think they were all on the same level? What do you think? Can't hear you. If you think that if you think that they thought they were on the same level, raise your hands. Okay, all right. And then the rest of you, like I think only those people who have their pictures showing raise their hands, or almost all of those. But Rav Soloveitchik at least implies, but I think actually directly said, is they understood. Yes, I remember. They definitely said they understood. They understood that Moshe was the greatest of them all. But they thought that they were still in the same ballpark. What God tells Moshe and Miriam after the inappropriate talking that took place between Miriam and Aaron, Hashem summons Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe pitom, immediately, without any warning. He says, we have an emergency meeting, report now. And Miriam and Aaron had to scramble to go to the mikveh to purify themselves, but not Moshe. Because Moshe kept himself spiritually pure all the time. And God illustrates with that. God illustrates by that Moshe was in a different category. That Moshe was, in Hebrew, segula. He was in a category of his own when it came to prophecy. Just as God tells Miriam and Aaron in the presence of Moshe, I speak directly to Moshe. No intermediate, no dreams. All the other prophets see God have a communication in their dream. Moshe can have a prophecy while he's awake. He is in a totally different category. And you should have known that, but you didn't know that. Now, I would take Rav Soloveitchik's explanation of that before we go to the next point to say that's why the Torah had to stick in the verse that Moshe was the most humble person of all people on earth. Because of his humility, Miriam and Aaron never picked up on the fact that Moshe was in a different category. So that's why that verse about Moshe's humility is put into last week's story. But the challenge to recognize both people and in the case of the land of Israel, a land, being in a totally separate category is another one of those challenges. And Rav Soloveitchik said that the sin of Miriam and Aharon was identical to the sin of the people we call the spies, more accurately, the tourists. because they did, in each case, it was not recognized that the victim of the negative speech was in a category of his or its own, not to be compared to anything else. Eretz Yisrael is a country like no other country. A country that Hashem pays attention to, as we say, maybe Rishit HaShanah, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, that he is always paying attention. Israel is the country that West Point Military Academy does not teach its battles because they feel there's no rational explanation how Israel won many of those battles. Because we can't really objectively measure God. But God plays a separate role, a special role in the land of Israel. A country in which its army was largely untrained in 1948, with many of them not even having a rifle to fight, should be able to defeat their Arab neighbors surrounding them. This is not a regular country. It is an Eretz Segula. It is a chosen country in a category of its own. Miriam and Aaron didn't recognize that uniqueness about Moshe, and the tourists that were sent by Moshe in this week's Parsha to check out the land as a tourist, to see, yeah, it really is, the land that God said, it's good, and we're in this kind of business, that part would be good for us, and et cetera, et cetera. The spies failed to realize that even things that looked to the eye difficult would not be difficult with God's help in God's chosen country. And that's the lesson that we have to learn. On the world scene, truthfully, many countries in the world can't get it that Israel is in a different category. We sometimes find hard to be fully cognizant of it as well. But it is that special Sigula gift, that precious gift, unique in its own status, that draws Hashem's attention. May we all look forward to having more of God's attention filled with blessings in our lives. I did unmute you at a point, so I'm going to unmute. And I'm going to wish you a good day, a good Shabbos. If there are any questions, you're welcome to ask them now. If you have a question, and if you are self-muted, you have to unmute. I just heard thunder, but I already made the bracha before. Any questions? Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Not sold. Okay, have a great day. Thanks for joining.
Okay, thank you. Good day, everybody. Good seeing some of you. Well,
it's good seeing everyone that we can see.
Well, we can't see everyone.
Hi, Barbara.
While somebody's on, I did use a headset now, but I'm wondering if somehow, because I hear, at times I've heard an echo, and no, I still hear an echo, even though I took it off. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to sign this off. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Barbara.
Bye.
It's Raina.
Oh, hi, Raina. There's actually more than one Barbara on the line, Raina.
Well, hi to all the Barbaras then.
Okay, sounds good.
Have a good Shabbos, everyone.
Thank you, too.
Good to hear your voice.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.